Hi. Um, Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah? Simona, can I give you a hug?
Já ano, já slyším.
Can I give you a hug? Thank you. Thank you.
Sen se mi splnil. Objímám Gábora za nás, za všechny, jak jsem vám řekla. Gábore, to je moje první otázka. Po vašem dokumentu jsem měla intenzivní pocit, že vás potřebuji obejmout a tím pádem se mi uleví a všechno se spraví. Jo? Chtěla jsem se zeptat, jak snášíte to, že tuto potřebu musí mít obrovské množství lidí po vašich vystoupeních a dokumentech? Kolik takových obětí už jste asi jako zažil? Teď jako počítám, že se budeme bavit v milionech. A co to s vámi dělá?
I'm just joking.
2 millions?
Well, it's not actually about me, you see. Because when people come to see Ivona, I heard earlier today, your wonderful interview with her, or when they come to see me, they're not looking for Ivona, they're not looking for me. They're looking for themselves. And we have some capacity, because we've done some work and maybe have some talent, to speak the truth about people. But it's the truth that people are looking for, not me, and not any other therapist or any other speaker. So when people are hugging me, they're actually hugging themselves, is what they're doing. What it does to me, when I was young and stupid at age 75, I might have, it kind of went to my head a little bit, or even before. But, the more comfortable I become myself, the less it matters what other people are finding or seeing in me, because ultimately we have to find that truth within ourselves. And the more you find it, the less you need somebody else to shine it to you or to show it to you. So I don't so much take it, it's very nice, I love it, and I love speaking and I love spreading my message, the way I understand truth. But it's no longer so important to me personally. Now, that may not be true. That's what I'm telling myself right now. But maybe when it's over and I don't have the words or the energy or, to speak these words and to be out there, maybe I'll find out that I'm very miserable. I don't know. But right now it feels like it's very comfortable and it doesn't change who I am. Now, I just want to warn you about something. If you're going to applaud every time I say something smart, you're going to be applauding all night. So just, it's not necessary.
S tím nelze než souhlasit. Moje druhá otázka je úplně banální. Jo? Já jsem jako vlastně dost těžko se vyrovnávám s tím, že vím, kolik je vám let a vypadáte, jak vypadáte a působíte dojmem mladistvého vysokoškolského studenta, který vypadá skvěle na to, že je mu šedé.
78.
No, já vím.
I'm 78.
Já vím a právě vám popisuju svůj šok. A snažím se s ním vyrovnat touto otázkou. Jestli takhle skvěle vypadáte, protože se o sebe bezvadně jako staráte, jíte správnou stravu, cvičíte, pečujete o svoje tělo, anebo jestli si myslíte, že je to tím, že přijímáte sám sebe takové, jaký jste a kašlete na to, co si o vás myslíme my.
It's the toupee. It's wonderful. You can't pull it off. It's amazing. No, you know what it is? There's a song by Bob Dylan that some of you may know. The lyrics are, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. So that when you come into the world, you don't have baggage. You might have some baggage, actually, from the time you spent in the womb, because we already know that the stresses on the pregnant woman affect the baby. So yeah, you might have some baggage, but relatively little. And as you start living in this traumatizing world, you start accumulating all this baggage. So it starts getting heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier. Now, if you're lucky enough, and if you get the help, you can start putting the baggage down. So the more you do that, the closer you get to your younger self. So yeah, I do exercise. I swim every morning, and I'm in a marriage where I'm forced to be authentic, you know, because my wife can't stand being married to a star. She didn't want a star, she wants me, you know, which sometimes I'm very angry about, but so that really makes a difference. But yes, it's coming to become your real self, the way you're meant to be. That's what keeps people young, I think, you know.
Chápu to správně tak, že ve 30 jste vypadal podstatně hůř než teď?
Well, you would have seen somebody much more tense, much more rigid, and much more caught up in his own ego. And you would have seen somebody very active in the world, but very stressed and often very depressed. That's what you would have seen.
Ano, i u sebe. Chtěla jsem se zeptat, jestli jste poprvé v Čechách a jestli jste poprvé v Praze?
Yeah, so let me tell you something about that. So it's my first time here, and I did want to take the opportunity to thank you all. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. I don't have to tell you that. The culture, but what I'm impressed by two things. One is the warmth of the people. Just such warmth and beautiful welcome and comfort for me here. Secondly, I'm very impressed that so many people are working so competently and so dedicatedly on the issue of trauma. But I'll tell you something personal. My mother actually was born in Košice, when it belonged to Austria-Hungary. But within a few months, as you know, it became part of Czechoslovakia. So until my mother was 23, she lived in Czechoslovakia. So growing up, and so her first language is Hungarian, but her second very fluent language was Czech. And she loved the Czech culture. And as growing up, I had three Czech heroes. First, not in any order, but first the great runner Emil Zatopek. Some of you remember him. I remember this lean figure, so courageous and so dedicated. So I remember being inspired watching him on film, number one. Number two, Schweik, you know, everybody thought he was an idiot, but actually he was the only sane person in the whole Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I still read that book every few years. I have to reread it because it's so wise and it's so funny. Now the third Czech hero was the hero of my mother. My mother was born on March the 7th, and there was somebody else that was born on March the 7th, who was Thomas Masaryk. And Thomas Masaryk, as you know, was the first president of Czechoslovakia. So every March the 7th, my mother would see flags and celebrations, and she thought it was all about her, you know. but my mother always told me, from the time I was very small, she gave me something that Masaryk apparently said, and maybe you've heard it. He said that it hurts to think, that it's painful to think. He said that. And we see that today, and it all has to do with trauma, because to think clearly is to see reality, and reality is often very painful. So a lot of people would rather escape from reality to escape from the pain of seeing it, and that's why Masaryk said that it hurts to think. And I never forgotten that. And one of my intentions in life was always to accept the pain of thinking. And if more people, everybody did that, we'd have a very different world, I think. So yes, I love being in Prague. And my aunt actually went to medical school here in Prague. She was a doctor.
Já se chci zeptat, protože trauma je univerzální věc, v tomhle jsme celosvětově na tom všichni stejně v té deformaci, a zároveň vy děláte workshopy v mnoha zemích při mnoha příležitostech. Jestli cítíte nějaké rozlišení, nějaký místní specifika, a jak byste zreflektoval včerejší workshop v Praze, který s vámi probíhal?
So, first of all, trauma. Now, it's one of those words, like God. Everybody uses it, but everybody means something different by it. So we have to agree on, at least for tonight, that when I speak about trauma, what am I speaking about? So by trauma, I'm not talking about terrible things that happen to people. I'm not talking about war. I'm not talking about rape. I'm not talking about physical abuse. I'm not talking about emotional abuse, a tsunami. I'm talking, because trauma, in my definition, is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And if you actually look at the word origin of trauma, it comes from the Greek, and it means a wound or wounding. So trauma is not what happened to you from the outside. Trauma is the wound that you sustained. So, as a really fine psychologist friend of mine said, all trauma is stressful, but not all stress is trauma. People can experience stress, people can experience anxiety, people can experience loss, people can experience pain, people can experience fear without being traumatized. So trauma is not the emotion, nor is it what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. So trauma is when you're wounded. And what happens when you're wounded? If you think of a wound as a physical experience, it has two aspects to it. One is that it's very sensitive. So if you have a wound, if I had touched myself here, no pain. But if there was a wound here, and if I touch myself, oh my God, severe pain. That's the trauma, when something hurts so much, when even somebody lightly touches it. So somebody says the wrong thing to you, if you're not traumatized, you'll just say, why did you say that? But if you're traumatized, then you say the same thing, why did you say that? Oh. So trauma is that sensitivity to pain. That's the one thing. The other aspect of a wound, which is kind of the opposite, but they both exist together, is that with a wound you get scarring, scar tissue. Now what's the nature of scar tissue? It doesn't feel, it has no nerve endings in it, it's rigid, it's inflexible, and it doesn't grow. So trauma then, first of all, makes you very sensitive to triggers of pain, and on the other hand, makes you not feel your emotions, makes you rigid, inflexible, you keep reacting the same way no matter what happens, and you can't grow emotionally as long as you're in a traumatized state. So that's what trauma is. Trauma is the wound that you experience eternally. And the biggest trauma, the biggest wound, is actually the disconnection from yourself. That's the biggest trauma. Now, for that to happen, you don't need these big, terrible things. I can give you an example from my personal life. I talk about this in my new book. Many of you know my personal history. I was born in January 1944. In March of 44, the Wehrmacht, the German army, occupies Hungary. And by that time, they had exterminated the Jewish population all over Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, but not yet in Hungary. And now it was the turn of the Hungarian Jews. So I was 2 months of age then. Some of you may have heard this story. The day after the Wehrmacht occupies Budapest, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, please come and see Gabor because he's crying all the time. And the doctor says, of course I'll come to see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now why do you think? Because babies are feeling the suffering and stress and fear of their mothers. So that was my first year living under those conditions. And then when I was a year old, my mother gave me to a stranger, as if you know my history, to save my life, and I didn't see her for 5 weeks. So you think maybe that's the trauma, and it is. Or that's a traumatic event. And you'd be right. But for a minute, forget the Nazis and forget the genocide and forget the war. Just go back to when I'm 2 weeks of age, still in the hospital with my mother, and she kept the diary. She wrote a diary, which I read about 3 years ago for the first time, 4 years ago. And here's her entry from when I'm 2 weeks of age. She said, "My poor little Gabor, my heart is breaking for you because you've been crying for the last hour and a half, wanting to be fed, to be breastfed. But I promised the doctor that I would only do it every 4 hours." So imagine, I'm lying there for an hour and a half, a newborn, wanting desperately to be picked up, to be held. That's my need, to be fed. And my mother, whose heart is breaking for me, is ignoring her own instincts and letting me cry. What message do I get? That my needs don't matter, that I'm not lovable, that I'm on my own. So what I'm saying about trauma is you don't need terrible things to happen to be wounded. It's enough sometimes that the good things that should happen do not happen. And you can be wounded that way too. So from that point of view, there's almost nobody in this modern culture of ours that isn't wounded. Almost nobody. Now, as to your question about different countries, now maybe I'm very sensitive to it, but when I go to Hungary, I'm going there tomorrow, there's a kind of heaviness in the air there. More than here, I would say. And what's interesting is that's not only my observation, but even people that I know who don't speak Hungarian have told me that when they go there, they feel a kind of heaviness, a dark, heavy energy. There's somebody that I know, a spiritual teacher who I interviewed once, and he said that when they were driving from Germany to Switzerland, and he hadn't realized that they'd crossed the border yet, but he felt a different energy. So I think if you're sensitive enough, and I'm not all that sensitive that way, but if you're sensitive enough, you'll pick up that there's different energies in different places, for sure. Yeah.
Rozumím.
Yeah. Szívesen.
A jestli chcete zreflektovat nějak včerejší workshop v Čechách, v Praze?
Only that, despite what I've said about different energies, the issues and the concerns and the traumas, the questions that people ask are the same everywhere I go. It doesn't matter what the culture is, what the country is. People are people. And fundamentally, I really enjoyed the workshop. I mean, you know, what's there not to enjoy? I stand in front of 200 people, and they all want to know what I think. I mean, what's there not to enjoy about that, you know? But it's the same, and there wasn't anything special about it, either in a good way or a bad way. It was just really good to talk with people who want to find out the truth. I just enjoy doing that. So that's my only reflection.
A já bych teďka dala prostor pro stále stejné lidské otázky. Takže přihlaste se, kdo máte nějaký dotaz. Tak já jsem si myslela, jak budu muset strašně házet míček, jak vás bude 200, ale evidentně prostě jste první.
Sorry, it's always me with the first question.
Now, before you ask questions, there's a couple of people I'd like. First of all, I want to thank all the organizers, Marketa, Zaya, my guide, Barbara, I mean, everybody who's been involved in creating this amazing experience for us. And I especially want to acknowledge, and I don't know where they're sitting right now, but the two people who actually made this film. It wasn't me who made it. It was not my film. They made it. They made it despite my own skepticism and even reluctance. So Zaya, Mauricio, where are you? Are you here somewhere? Okay, would you stand up for a minute and just come up here? Just coming up here for a minute, okay? So, sorry? Yeah, you can have a hug, sure.
Finally.
No, not you.
Free.
So these two people, I spoke at a conference that they've been organizing conferences for 15 years or more. I spoke at a conference they organized in California, and 4 years ago or 5 years ago, we had lunch in San Francisco, and they said, "We're going to make a movie about you." And I said, "Oh yeah, sure, you're going to make a movie about me, you know?" And they did. So here they are, and people say sometimes, "Thank you for your film," but I have to tell them it's not my film. It's not my film at all. It's really the vision and the creative artistry and the really hard work of these two people. And when they finished the first draft of the movie, they asked me what I thought about it. And I didn't like it very much. There's some things I didn't like about it. They worked for another year to make it the movie that you finally saw. And when Zaya and Marty have told me that when they first thought to distribute the film, they thought maybe 10,000 or 20,000 psychotherapists in the United States may want to see the film. Within a week that they put it online, it had been seen by 4 million people in over 200 countries. And since then, another 3 or 4 million. So all that is due to them, and I just want to acknowledge you. But that's not what the miracle is. The miracle is that we've been traveling together now for a couple of weeks, first in Turkey, and then in Bulgaria, and then in Germany, and now we're here, and we still like each other, which is really amazing. All right, I'm ready for questions.
My tomu říkáme přátelství.
I'm here, on your right.
Oh, is that what you call it? Yeah, it's a good name.
My name is Desiree. I'm here.
There.
Yes, go ahead, please, yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
I wanted to thank the filmmakers because I found it very moving. I think not just me. And I think this is an experience that we all need to be moved. And one of the questions that arose, because I kept seeing myself and my life and experiences in the film, is with clients, it's a lot easier because it's more one way to share their addiction, to be with them in the addiction. But what about in personal relationships where your feelings and needs are also at stake and the other person might not be capable at that time to also meet you? How to deal with that?
You know, maybe 7 years ago, my daughter, who's now studying psychology in New York, she came to a retreat that I led, and she watched me work the whole day with a group of about 25 people. And at the end of the day, she came to me in tears of rage. And she said, "You're like a guru with these people. You're so kind and you're so wise. Why can't you be like that with me?" So I understand exactly what you're asking. And the spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle pointed out once that some people have the capacity to channel truth and presence and a sense of being in their professional lives, but they're not able to do it in their personal lives. And I think that's true for so many of us. I think it takes time to catch up to ourselves. So some people never do. Some great teachers and spiritual teachers and therapists never catch up to themselves in their personal lives. Again, as I've said to you, I've been fortunate enough to be in a relationship where that's not acceptable. And so growth for me has had to be an essential. I'm also interested in it for myself, but when the relationship demands it, there's even more motivation. So yes, it's continued work to be or to channel or to see what I do here on stage or working with people in my own home, with my own family. It's a challenge. It's an ongoing challenge. Sometimes I don't do so well at it. I'm a whole lot better than I used to be, but it's a challenge.
It sounds like it really helps you to have someone set expectations for you and to kind of set
absolutely. There's this standard joke about the guy late at night drinking in the bar, and he's, inebriated, and he's complaining to the bartender, "My problem is that my wife doesn't understand me." My version of it is that I'm sitting in the bar, inebriated, and I'm saying to the bartender, "My problem is that my wife understands me." Yeah.
Prostor pro další dotaz a určitě vyzvu i... ano, chytla jsi to. Jo, určitě. Já jsem to jako nedořekla, už se to dělo, tak už jsem neměla potřebu to doříct.
I have a question about vulnerability. Vulnerability, what's your take on that? And because I think it's a great way of having human connection, being vulnerable with someone. What do you think is the place of vulnerability in trauma and healing it?
Sure. So again, I'm very interested in the origins of words, and vulnerability comes from a Latin word for wounding. Vulnerare is to wound. Now, human beings are vulnerable. We're vulnerable from the moment that we're conceived in the womb until we die. We're vulnerable. There's nothing we can do to protect ourselves from vulnerability. But when we're hurt in that vulnerability, then we do a lot of things to protect ourselves from feeling and experiencing a vulnerability. It is so scary. I mean, my mother doesn't pick me up when I'm crying, when I'm 2 weeks of age. I can't open myself to that kind of pain again. So I shut down my heart, So nothing can protect me from being vulnerable, but my mind can try to protect me from my awareness of my vulnerability. Now the problem with shutting down our awareness of vulnerability is that you stop growing. Because for growth, emotional, you need vulnerability. Nothing in nature grows without vulnerability. So if you think of a crab inside a hard shell, it can't grow. If it wants to grow, what does it have to do? It has to mold. It has to shake off the shell and be very soft. And then it can be eaten. But if it doesn't get out of that shell, it can't grow. A tree doesn't grow where it's hard and thick. It grows where it's soft and green and vulnerable. That's where it can be eaten. So there's a real problem in that without openness to a vulnerability, we cannot grow. But if we're open to a vulnerability, we can be hurt. And that's why so many people are afraid of therapy. That's why it's so important that when you do work with people, or if you work as a client, that there's absolute safety to be vulnerable. If there's no absolute safety to be vulnerable, growth is absolutely impossible. Okay? Yeah. And that means you're going to feel the pain. But again, the pain is not the trauma. The trauma is your disconnection from yourself.
Thank you for being here. I have 2 questions. The first one is, what makes us resistant to developing trauma?
Developing trauma? How do you mean what makes us resistant to develop? You mean what can protect us from trauma? Is that what you're asking? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So, human contact, human support, connection, See, the child has basic needs. I could talk to you about what the needs of children are, but one of the needs of children, an absolute need, by an absolute need, I mean that if it's not satisfied, then the outcome will not be so good. So one of the needs of children is to be able to feel all their emotions and to experience all their emotions in their bodies. Anger, rage, sadness, joy, happiness, fear. They need to be able to experience this. But they can only do that if there's somebody there who can receive those emotions and hold the child in those emotions. See, children have no capacity, small children especially, beginning with babies, they have no capacity to regulate their own emotional states. A baby, you can feed them and look after them physically, but if you don't pick them up, they may actually die because they will stress themselves to death because they can't regulate their nervous systems. So the healthy development of the child requires that the child has got the freedom to experience all their emotions, but that there's a nurturing adult who can safely hold the child. And the more developed brain of the adult will regulate the brain of the child. If that happens, there's no trauma. There might be pain, there might be loss, there might be grief, but no trauma. Trauma happens where there's not that holding. So let me give you one example. In Britain, in the Second World War, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was bombing London. And so the British government decided, reasonably, that they should move some children away from London into the countryside to stay with strangers so that they'd be protected from the bombing. So some children were moved into the countryside away from their parents. Others stayed in London where there was the air raids and the sirens and the air raid shelters and the loud noise of explosions. Some years later, when they looked at the two groups, which do you think was the healthier one, mentally speaking? It was the children that stayed with their parents. So what protects you is that connection. And Alice Miller, the great Swiss-German, Polish-Swiss-German psychotherapist, asked the question of, why is it that two children can undergo externally the similar kind of experiences, but one of them will be severely traumatized, the others will not be? And she said the difference was the presence of what she called an empathetic witness. An empathetic witness is somebody who maybe couldn't protect the child from the events that were going on, but who could listen to and validate the child's feelings. So that's connection. Human connection is the protection from trauma.
Poprosím ještě o jeden dotaz tady z publika, než přijde na řadu dotaz z pódia.
I wanted to ask you, when we are on the therapy and we work with our traumas, and I would like to ask you how we can start to work with the emotions, because the brain knows, we know what happened and why it happens, we understand, but how to work with emotions, how to go through it and start to new living with what happened lately or before.
Yeah. Intellectual understanding is helpful, but it's not enough. And as you suggest, we have to actually go through the emotions. Now, the question you have to ask is, why didn't we go through those emotions in the first place? Because we're alone. It was too painful, and we weren't strong enough to handle it. We couldn't have been, because we were small and we didn't have that capacity. So, for most people, the how to experience those emotions is not a question of how, because those emotions will be experienced naturally in the right context. But that right context has to be one of absolute safety in a therapeutic relationship, or maybe in a personal relationship. So when I heard Ivona speak today earlier, you can sense about her how safe you are with her. And when you're safe with somebody, those emotions will arise. So it's not a question of how to feel the emotions. You don't have to work at feeling anything. That will naturally happen in the right context. So for me, the issue is not how we do something, but where and with whom we do it. And in the situation of safety, we'll feel our emotions. I talked to somebody today about their childhood trauma and so on, and they felt their emotion, and after 5 minutes, and I'm not saying about me, I'm saying this is what happens. When that person was able to feel their emotions, their whole body changed. Their whole body changed, as they will tell you if you spoke to them. So again, it's not the how to do something, it's the context.
Hello, Gabor. Dr. Neufeld talks a lot about tears and sadness. It's something very essential in healing trauma. How do you see this?
Yeah, so Gordon Neufeld is a very good friend of mine. He lives in Vancouver, Canada, where I do. And I have to confess that my work would be much poorer without his influence. I say this not because he's my friend, but because I honestly see this. He understands human development and the needs of children way beyond what anybody else in the world does. To me, in my mind, he's the most astute developmental psychologist in the world. And there's a book called Hold On to Your Kids, which we wrote together, but actually it's his work. I just did the writing with him because he's brilliant, but he's not a writer. And so my wife finally said, call him and offer to write the book with him. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll call Gordon. Gordon, you won't help write the book? And he said, I thought you'd never call, you know. So we wrote the book together, but it's his work, it's his ideas. And in my new book, I quote him extensively because I can't turn to anybody to understand children and the needs of children as astutely as he does. Now, he once said, Gordon once said, he said, and he's also very poetic the way he speaks, and he said, we shall be saved in an ocean of tears. We shall be saved in an ocean of tears. And what he means by that is that when bad things happen to us, or when we don't get our needs met, we develop all kinds of ways of coping with that. Addictions, mental health conditions, rage, or the suppression of rage. And we do all this because we don't want to feel the grief. Now, scientifically speaking, there's a great neuroscientist he's from Estonia, actually, I think. He's no longer alive. I wish he was. He died in his 70s. But his name was Dr. Jaak Panksepp. And Jaak was a wonderful man. He distinguished 7 brain systems that we share with other mammals. There's one for caring, which is essential. Otherwise, if you don't care for children, we don't survive. One for lust. One for anger. One for play, which is really important in human development. Not just human development, but the development of all mammals. They all play. It's really important for brain development, which, by the way, we forget in the modern world. The importance of play, free play, in nature. So we have circuits in the brain for all this. We also have circuitry for grief. We have circuitry in our brain for grief. Why do we have circuitry in our brains for grief? Because life is full of loss. That's the nature of life. Not only loss, but also loss. At some point, if nature is moving in the way it needs to, we're going to lose our parents. Parents may lose their children. Partners may lose their lovers. Friends will lose their friends. All kinds of losses. Or maybe smaller losses, like other children don't want to play with me. My father is not available. These are losses. Now, the only way to move through it is to feel the sadness, to feel the grief. When we feel the grief, because grieving is all about something is lost, it's gone, and I accept that. That's what grief is. So Gordon says, we'll be saved in an ocean of tears. And what it means is, if we can grieve our losses, just to give one current example, and by the way, I don't explain the war in Ukraine just by the pathology of one particular man. I think it's much more complicated. But that is a traumatized man. I'm not saying this to excuse anything. I'm just saying that he was. And as Ivona pointed out this afternoon, so was Hitler, so was Stalin. By the way, so are a large number of leaders in the world, in all countries. I could talk to you about that, but I won't right now. If they had grieved their loss, they would not be inflicting all this pain on the world. So that's what Gordon means, is that we've saved in an ocean of tears. If we grieve, we let go. If we deny our grief, we hold on. That holding on creates all kinds of dysfunction. Okay? And by the way, here in Czechia, I think there's a Neufeld Institute, Neufeld, and any of you who are parents, I suggest you check it out. It'll be tremendous support to you. Okay? Yeah.
Předejte někomu, kdo se hlásí.
Hello, good evening, and thanks for coming. From Therapist.
I'll see you. Where are you?
I am right here. Hello. On your left.
Okay, yeah, hi.
I was wondering, most of us need help from therapists, but sometimes people doesn't have money or the therapists aren't available, right? And could you please recommend something for those people who need to work with their trauma and doesn't really have the professional care around? Is there anything what we can do by ourselves or maybe with our friends or some kind of support? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's a real problem. I mean, one of the reasons I'm standing in front of you right now is because when I was a family doctor, I realized that so many of the illnesses, physical illnesses, autoimmune diseases, cancers, depressions, anxieties, addictions of my clients or my patients were based on the impacts of trauma. But what could I do with them? I couldn't send them to psychologists, private psychologists, because the part of Vancouver where I was working was not a rich area, so people couldn't afford private psychotherapy, just as you suggest. I also couldn't send them to psychiatrists. The psychiatrists are medical doctors, so in Canada, they're paid by the medical plan, but they're not trained in talking to people. Mostly they're trained in handing out pills, which sometimes work and sometimes are necessary, but talking to people and listening to people and asking the right questions, it's not the training they receive. So what could I do with people? I decided to start talking with them myself. So I invited them. I say, well, okay, at the end of the day, come in and we'll have half an hour or 40 minutes, let's just talk. And that's where I began to develop this method that now they call, or we call, compassionate inquiry, which is my method of doing therapy. But it evolved basically because of the same problem that you just described. Now, what can you do? Well, first of all, fortunately these days, there's a lot of information out there that's not so hard to access. So, for example, my talks are on YouTube. I didn't put them there, other people did, but they've been seen by a lot of people. There's lots of other great talks on trauma and its implications on YouTube. So one thing people might do I don't know what's available in the Czech language, but this movie, The Wisdom of Trauma, is available now with Czech subtitles, and there's a website for it. There's a website for it, so people could watch that. And what if 5 people watched it together and they just talked with each other, share their experiences? That alone would take them a long distance. People can learn how to be mindful and meditate. And meditation means, and I know there was an exercise here today in mindfulness. In mindfulness, you can observe your mind without being taken over by it. You can observe your pain or your thoughts. Mindfulness. There's nature. A lot of people find relief just by walking out in nature. Now in your country, you have a lot of beautiful nature, mountains and rivers and valleys. That would really be helpful to people. I also know that here, I've heard about some organizations here that are especially for people who can't afford therapy. Some kind of group therapy. I don't remember the name of the particular organization, but somebody told me about it. So I think the real question is not just lack of funds for therapy, but the lack of awareness of people that they need help. Once people realize they need help and they start looking, usually they can find something. Usually they can find something. Not to mention books, my books, the books of other people. There's this book called The Body Keeps the Score by my friend Bessel van der Kolk. That's a big international bestseller, and it's not an easy read. But despite the fact that it's not an easy read, millions of people have read it, because it speaks to them. So there's lots of help out there, even if you can't afford a private therapist.
So, hello Gabor. First of all, thank you very much for coming
Just tell me where you are, would you?
Když tak si prosím vás
Okay, I see you.
stoupněte,
Thank
aby
you.
vás
Thank you. Yeah.
Gábor viděl.
Go ahead.
It's very touching for me to feel your warmth. I have a question.
Can you tell my wife that?
I can. I have a question.
Sorry. Yeah.
I'm pregnant, and you mentioned several times today or in your movie that the baby can feel the emotions in the womb, and it can influence, I don't know, its existence. But at the same time, 9 months is quite a long time, and everybody is traumatized. So, of course, some of my traumatic feelings sometimes pop up, and moreover, the pregnancy brings also higher sensitivity. And knowing that when I'm going through, I don't know, a big fear or anxiety or sadness, that I'm actually influencing my baby in a negative way is putting more stress on me. So I would like just to ask you for some words how to handle that.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So, first of all, if you remember what I said about trauma, it's not the sadness or the anger or the pain, okay? It's the suppression of it, because you're alone. So if you experience those feelings, if you have somebody to talk to about them, and they hear you, and you experience yourself as being heard and understood, it's not a problem. Not a problem for the baby. Not a problem for you, okay? Now the problem in the modern world is that when we look at human evolution, we did not evolve in cities. We did not evolve in cities. We evolved out there in nature, in small groups, hunter-gatherer bands, 60 to 80 people. In those communities, and this is our evolution, this is our nature, in those communities, mothers were never alone, and they had all kinds of support. And let me tell you a story. I gave a talk in Canada to an indigenous group, to an indigenous Canadian group, Aboriginal people in Canada. Now, they're the most traumatized people in our country, horribly traumatized. I won't go into the details now, but you can read about it. What's been done to them for hundreds of years, and especially the last 150 years, it's inhumane. So they have the highest rate of suicide and addiction and violence and sexual abuse. And as I've said to a number of people, in our jails, 30% of the people in jail in Canada are First Nations origin. They make up 4% of the population. 50% of the people, of the women in jail are Aboriginal. They make up 4% of the population. And an Aboriginal woman in Canada has 6 times the risk of rheumatoid arthritis. They're never used to have rheumatoid arthritis. So that's the actual situation. But they knew how to parent before colonialism took over. They parented a whole lot better than we do. And in that environment, women had the support. So once I was giving a talk in an indigenous community, and this man came up to me and said, and I was saying all this stuff about prenatal stress, and he said to me, you know, doctor, in our community, we used to have a tradition, a rule, which is that if there was a pregnant woman and you were angry and stressed, you were not permitted to go near them because we didn't want you passing on your stress and rage onto the baby. They had no brain scans, they had no heart rate monitoring, they had no ultrasounds, they had no blood tests, they had intuition or wisdom. But the situation was very different because they gave birth and they parented in a completely different environment. Now, the situation of women today is very, very difficult. So let me give you one particular fact. In the 1930s, at least in North America, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was 1 to 1. So for every man diagnosed, there was a woman. The gender ratio now is 3.5 women to every man. What's happened? It can't be the genetics, that hasn't changed. It can't be the climate or the food, because that's the same for both genders. What it is that women are much more stressed now. Not because it's their own fault, but because of the cultural expectation that they should be the emotional caregivers to everybody, and they should work to make money for the family. And this is in a situation where there's more and more loneliness, more and more isolation. So when we're talking about the problem of the pregnant woman, we're not talking about some isolated problem of an individual. We're talking about a huge cultural, social, economic problem. And so I'm saying that on the individual level, get support. Make sure that the partner is on side. You know, my wife, when she was pregnant with one of our children, I was a workaholic doctor and I was almost hostile. And she had a very difficult time. And that affected our child. So it's not just a question of the individual woman. It's a question of the relationship that she is in and the relationships that surround her. So if you have pain, anxiety, whatever, that's okay. Talk to people. Make sure you get the support. That way, you will not be passing it on to your child. And as a society, we really have to think about what we're doing. Because what we're doing right now is not working.
Poprosím o další dotaz z publika, jestli už došlo k setkání.
Hello.
Těch 2 předmětů, jejichž jméno nebudu už vyslovovat.
Hello, Gabor. First of all, I just wanted to say you're my complete superstar. I'm here
where are you?
in the middle.
Okay, hi, yeah. Hi.
Hi. And I just wanted to ask, and partially you replied already on the previous question. It's been about last 8 years since I started to look deeper in how we live in our Western society, capitalism, how we destroy the planet Earth and stuff like that. So basically, what do you think about today's society? How much is like basically generating more and more trauma because the humanity is really suppressed right now, and we celebrate money and stuff like that. And the second part of the question is, you said you travel a lot around other countries and meet a lot of similar questions. And I just wanted to ask, and I really wonder if it's the same, for example, in India or in Thailand, or other countries where the bond between mother and child is still really healthy and holy and spiritual in a way. And how do you see what traumas they deal with, or if it's different than from our Western culture and society?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So the first question, again, I don't mean to be advertising myself, but my next book is called The Myth of Normal, and the subtitle is Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. What I'm saying is that this culture, by its very nature, hurts people, and that the diseases and the dysfunctions are not abnormalities. They are natural responses to an abnormal situation. Because from the point of view of human need, if the question you're asking is, what are human needs? It's very simple. Look at how we evolved. We evolved in connection, not in competition against each person against everybody else, not everybody living in isolation, but people cooperating, working together. That's how we evolved. That's what our nature demands. So any system that's based on the belief that people are aggressive and selfish and just out for themselves, that's going to deny human needs. And as soon as you make profit the goal, instead of, like, what if this society asked, well, I have a friend, you may have heard of him, I don't know if he's known in North America, in Eastern Europe, but his name is Rafi, and he's a children's singer, very famous children's singer, millions of records sold, and he's a beautiful singer of songs to children, R-A-F-F-I. And one day he was lying in bed, and he was very famous. He sang at the White House. He's just internationally known. And one day he woke up and he had this idea, and he couldn't sleep. And the idea was what he called a child-honoring society, a society that honors the needs of children. Now, if we actually had a society that honored the needs of children, let alone human beings in general, would we be destroying the climate? Would we be making profits by selling junk food to young kids? Would we be creating gadgets that are deliberately designed to make little babies addicted? That's what we're doing right now. Why? Because it's profitable. In other words, we profit off, or the society profits off, denying and exploiting the unmet needs of human beings. So that's why I'm saying that we're living in a toxic culture. Now, that's the first part of your question, and I'm sorry I've forgotten the second part. What was it?
How is it, for example, in India or
India,
Thailand?
Okay, I got it.
Like,
so,
what kind of trauma they have? And
well, it's mixed. It's mixed, and here's the reason that it's mixed. There's a movie made about 15, 20 years ago. I think the title was Babies, or maybe Infants. And what they did is they followed 4 babies from birth until 1 year of age. It was a documentary, fascinating film. Someone was from Japan, another one from San Francisco, somebody, I think, somewhere in Mongolia, and then somebody in Africa. So they just followed these, there was no commentary, if I remember, they just followed these babies. Now the African child spent all his time in the company of his mother and other adults. So when adults were sitting there making music, there was the baby. When adults were making food, all together as a community, there was the baby. Everywhere the mother went or the father went, the baby was carried with them. It was quite astonishing at the end of at 1 year of age, when you looked at these 4 children, that African kid was so grounded. He was like a warrior at 1 year of age, powerful and confident, and you know, like this, as compared to the other kids. Because of the needs being met for adult companionship, nurturing, contact, support, acceptance. Now, as to your question about Thailand and India, so my compassion and inquiry program, we've done it in India, online, but we had a special event just for India. Many people are very traumatized there. Even though they have more community, but especially the women are very suppressed. So for a woman to aspire to be herself and to express herself and to resist the domination of her mother-in-law or her husband or her father, it's almost unthinkable. So these people are really struggling. Now, Thailand may be a different story. I haven't worked much in Thailand, but I do know that a lot of people go there because they like the atmosphere, they like the environment. They find a kind of peace and joy there that is difficult to find elsewhere. So I can't comment on Thai society, but I can tell you that in India, it's a very mixed situation, not to mention the caste system in India, where some people are still considered to be inferior. India, despite all the spiritual truths and all the spiritual beauty that they have expressed, which I genuinely acknowledge, it's a very traumatizing place for a lot of people. That's what I found.
Další dotaz. Já to tak jako cítím, že už si to předáváte sami, tak už se do toho...
Jo, předáváme. Dobrý den, Gábore. Já se omlouvám, ale nevládnu angličtinou, takže budu mluvit česky. Já jsem dula a věnuju se podpoře žen, doprovázím k porodům, pomáhám s laktací a chtěla jsem se zeptat, protože ono se to tady vine a já za to nesmírně děkuju, protože to jsou slova, která je potřeba, aby hlavně odborná společnost slyšela, že vlastně ta podpora rodící a těhotné ženy, ať už je to třeba s porodní asistentkou komunitní, která třeba není psychoterapeut, takže řekněme, že je to člověk, který je profesionálem v tom porodnictví, ale není profesionálem v psychoterapii, anebo třeba právě laická podpora duly je nesmírně důležitá pro to psychické zdraví těhotné ženy a pro vlastně její těhotenství. Chtěla jsem to takto nahlas říct a zároveň se vás zeptat, jestli máte ze světa nějaké srovnání, kde právě fungují ty systémy, protože v České republice tento systém nefunguje. Tady je prostě pouze porodní asistentka v porodnici a na ty komunitní porodní asistentky se pohlíží jinak. Každopádně vy přednášíte na celém světě, tak se chci zeptat, jak to je.
So before I answer your question, would you please honestly tell the audience that I didn't pay you to ask that question? Okay? Because that's a whole chapter in my new book. Okay? So is prenatal life. But birth is a whole chapter in my book. Okay? And as a medical doctor, I was trained to deliver babies a certain way. So in my medical career as a family physician, I helped at the deliveries of about 1,000 babies over 22 years. And the way I was taught that women should deliver babies was to lie on their backs and put their feet into stirrups. I'll show you, kind of like this. You know? And that's what I was, and not only that, as soon as the baby's head began to reach the opening, I was taught to make a cut, to make the opening bigger. That's called an episiotomy. And every doctor, that's how we practice medicine, delivery. This is in normal deliveries, when there was no problem, okay? Now, then I met some midwives who, at that time in Canada, were working illegally, but they were delivering babies at home. And they taught me that, you know, the woman doesn't have to lie on her back with her feet in the air. And when I questioned that, now pardon me, I'm going to use maybe rude language here, but one of these midwives said to me, "Oh yeah? Try taking a shit lying on your back." So I learned that women could actually squat, or they could stand, or they could lie on their side. And furthermore, miracle of miracles, I learned that I didn't have to cut them, that nature actually knew how to deliver babies. So, but as a medical doctor, you're trained to think only of the dangers that can go wrong. You're not trained to work with nature. Now, midwives and doulas are trained to work with nature. Now, it's not arguable, it's not controversial that modern obstetrics can save lives of mothers and babies. So it's a miracle. But unfortunately, we've come from a situation of interfering only when we have to interfering all the time. Now, birth is not just a way of getting a baby out from the uterus. It's actually an important life experience. Physiologically, it's a life experience. Psychologically, it's a life experience. Physiologically, it's a life experience because during birth, during natural birth, both in the mother and in the baby, there are hormones that are released. And some researchers have called that a love cocktail. That mix of hormones help the mother bond with the baby and the baby bond with the mother. When we interfere with that, we're interfering with the release of those hormones. Furthermore, when we only expect danger, secondly, guess what? There's been research now. Doctors, somebody I know, actually, a Canadian doctor, did formal research about 30 years ago. You know what they found out? You don't have to cut every woman. Nature actually can get the baby out of there without your help. Amazing. Because first you make a cut, then you have to sew it up. You make a wound when it's not necessary most of the time. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. So, we're interfering. There's another very important aspect here, which is that birth is probably one of the most experiences, not probably, it's one of the most important experiences a woman goes through. Now, one of the needs of people, anybody, is that they have agency. Agency is the capacity to make the decisions for yourself about how your life's going to go. We all need that. When we reduced the woman, and this doctor friend of mine who did the research on episiotomies, these cuts, he said that the way we train doctors is like their pelvis is an explosion waiting to happen. Now, when you reduce a woman to explosion waiting to happen, you're taking away their agency. And that will have an impact on how they raise their children. Because what we're teaching women is you can't trust your own bodies. You have to listen to the experts. In fact, you have to surrender yourself to the experts. Whereas doulas and midwives, they're there to support the woman in their own agency. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should have a natural birth. I'm not prescribing how people should give birth. What I'm saying is that they need to have agency. And modern medicine takes that away. And that'll affect how they raise their children. Because it'll cut them off from it'll help to cut them off from their own instincts. So there was a very interesting book published in the United States maybe 7, 8 years ago now. It was about women who come from Asia. These are Hmong women, H-M-O-N-G. They come from Southeast Asia. Without going into the history of it, a large community of them came to the United States. And they clashed with the medical system because these women refused to lie down and put their feet into stirrups. These women refused to give permission for these episiotomies. They gave birth squatting. Their husbands were behind them and massaged their bellies with their saliva, and they hummed to them. And for some reason, these crazy women wouldn't accept the American way of delivering babies. So, around the world, the rate of cesarean section is going up. In my province of British Columbia, Canada, it's almost 40% now. Almost 4 every 10 births are happening with cesarean section. And this is increasing all around the world. It's been studied. There's been big research on it the last few years. In China, it's going up, and especially amongst well-educated, higher-class women, because they're so disconnected from their bodies, and they're so intent on their careers. So we're doing great damage to our children and to the mothers by the way we are delivering babies. And I'm sure you know the work of Michel Audin, the French obstetrician, and he said that we need to give birth back to the midwives, which means giving it back to nature. That's what she said, and I totally agree with him.
Jenom abyste věděl, Gábore, v Čechách jsou ty aktivity té snahy vrátit se k přirozeným porodům velmi silné a ty překážky jsou velmi velké, že u nás já cítím vlnu té snahy o návrat k možnosti přirozeným porodům, abychom aspoň měli alternativu. Už dlouhé roky, vnímám to přes 20 let velmi silně, ale jakoby přes tu vládu, přes to obvyklé zdravotnictví, to jde velmi těžce, takže vždycky se nám podaří jeden krůček tam a pak se nám stáhnou zase 2 krůčky zpátky. Tak jsem vám jenom chtěla říct český kontext, že ta vlna zájmu o to v Čechách, nebo aspoň jak já ji vnímám, je hodně veliká.
Let me tell you one story from my new book. This is unbelievable. This is a woman in California. His name is Sherry Dolman. She was 17 years old when she had her first baby, a traumatized teenager, all by herself. So the delivery naturally didn't go very well. So she had a cesarean section. 17 years later, she gets pregnant again. And she wants to have a non-medical delivery. So she goes to obstetricians, 10 obstetricians, and they all tell her, no, you can't have a baby vaginally after you've had a cesarean section. Now, here's what's amazing about it. Medically, they were totally wrong. By the time they said that, there was lots of research showing the absolute safety of what's called VBAC, vaginal birth after cesarean section. It wasn't even controversial. But none of these obstetricians were willing to support her non-medicalized birth. She even went to see a specialist in high-risk pregnancy who did a detailed ultrasound scan of her uterus, and he said, your risk of a problem of your uterus tearing is no greater than it would be as if you'd never had a child. This is official opinion. Despite that, the obstetrician said, no, we're going to book your cesarean section. And Sherry kept saying, no, I won't do that. Then she goes to the hospital for a routine ultrasound around 38 weeks. When she tries to leave the hospital, they stop her and they said, we're going to arrest you if you don't agree to the cesarean section. We're going to arrest you for harming your baby. They literally forced her into a cesarean section. That was the second baby. By the time she had her third baby, she was working with a midwife in British Columbia, a good friend of mine actually, a midwife. She had a vaginal birth, totally healthy. She said it was the most painful, but the most exhilarating experience of my whole life, because I was in charge. This is 7 or 8 years after, 10 obstetricians told her that this is impossible. And then she had, 3 years later, she had a 4th baby, over 9 pounds, 4 or more kilograms, vaginally. This is again after she was told by all these specialists. So I'm telling you, the medical world is hard to explain, the rigidity and the lack of openness. And what's worse, their failure to even look at the science. We keep talking about, I'm not attacking individual doctors here. There are many great ones. I'm talking about the ideology of the system. It's so rigid, it's so afraid of nature, it's so afraid of trusting individuals and their own healing process. It so wants to be in control and to dominate and to be absolutely safe that actually we're making people's lives much harder in so many ways. So that's the story with obstetrics. And this is true not just here in Czechia, but it's true everywhere.
A bohužel nejen porodnictví.
Hello. I have one question here from the left wing. We don't have a ball here, so I'd like to hop in. Here.
So just tell me where you are.
On the right.
On the right.
Míček už je dávno pasé.
Okay, hi.
Okay. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Pavel, I'm a psychotherapist. I would like to ask you about one term which is quite intriguing now in the world, which is now, I think it's quite related to the trauma, and I think you can meet it quite oftenly. It's spiritual bypass. It's
spiritual bypass?
Yeah, it's spreading like a disease here, and I can find it really, really regularly during my sessions, so I'd like to just get your insight. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Spiritual bypass, which means that you have these beautiful spiritual experiences of peace and stillness and unity with the universe and God, and your personal life is a complete mess. Okay? Now, I could name you at least 5 well-known, world-famous spiritual teachers, Buddhist teachers. I'm not even talking about the Catholic Church, I mean, my God. But Buddhist spiritual teachers who are written beautiful books on wisdom and transcendence and oneness, who for decades sexually abused their followers. I don't have to name names, but I could name you 5 at least, just like that. So, which means that it's entirely possible to see the truth in one realm and completely miss it in another realm, because these people had not done their emotional work. So they do the spiritual work, and they have a special talent for it, but they did not do the emotional work. Now let me tell you, if you want my advice, if you're going to follow somebody who's done their emotional work and their spiritual work. But if they haven't done their emotional work, don't follow them. And this is very common, not just on the big level of famous leaders, world-famous leaders actually. I mean, there's a book called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Not the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Beautiful book. I quoted it all the time. I don't quote it anymore, because the monk who wrote it was an abuser, it turned out. Many of these very famous people. So that's spiritual bypass. Now, on the individual level, it's very nice to sit there on the cushion and to have beautiful visions or feelings of peace, that's great. But if you want to know how spiritually advanced you are, ask yourself, what am I like with my partner? What am I like with my children? What am I like with myself? So if you have these beautiful experiences, but your emotional and relational life is troubled and confused, then you haven't worked through your trauma. And then you're just bypassing all that to have a really nice spiritual experience. This is true for people even who work with psychedelics, that they can have these beautiful experiences, but if they don't integrate it into their lives, it's just a bypass. It's a very major problem, so thanks for asking.
Thank you very much.
Já také děkujeme. Já dám s dovolením teďka prostor někomu zase z publika na pódiu, ať je to vyrovnané.
Děkuji. Dobrý večer, Gabore.
Můj
sen je splněn. Já s dovolením budu mluvit česky, pro mě je to teď tady v tomhletom prostředí asi jednodušší. Já pracuji víc než 15, nebo skoro 15 let se ženami, které se potýkají s nemocí zvaná endometrióza. A je to nemoc, kterou dnes prokazatelně trpí 1 žena z 10 na celém světě. A sama za sebe ji mám vyléčenou, prošla jsem tím a teď pracuji jako terapeut pro tyto ženy. A mě by ohromně zajímalo vlastně, co si o této nemoci myslíte vy. Já sama ji vnímám jako trauma, které je nevyřešené. Děkuji moc krát za odpověď.
Yeah. Well, yes. Not only are you right intuitively, you also right scientifically. There's been studies that show that the more trauma a woman has, the greater her risk for endometriosis. Now, why should that be the case? It's the case because trauma isn't simply a psychological event. It affects your body. It changes your hormones. It changes your nervous system. It makes you behave in ways that are stressful. Like my guess is that before you worked with your trauma, you had great difficulty saying no to other people's emotions, right? Now, why was that? Because in childhood you learned that in order to survive, you had to suppress your own feelings and your own needs and to serve other people. And so I've written a book called When the Body Says No. Your body said no in a form of endometriosis. So endometriosis is, in my view, a trauma response because of its effect on the body. And you're quite, now, unfortunately, when you go to see doctors about these problems, they will tell you, oh, you got this disease, and all we can do is surgery to get rid of it, but there's nothing you can do to heal, which just isn't true. Because I know all kinds of people with these diseases who are able to heal, not because of surgery, but because they deal with their traumas. And they learn how to say no. I bet you're much better at saying no than you used to be. Yes? I'm sure. And so, again, what I'm talking about, my profession, my big complaint about my profession is not that we keep talking about evidence-based practice. My problem is we don't look at the evidence, or we look at some very narrow part of the evidence. Now, endometriosis is a risk factor, as you probably know, for cancer of the ovary. Now, 3 years ago, there was a study from Harvard that showed that the more symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder a woman experiences, the greater her risk for ovarian cancer. Now, if that was the only study ever done, that should have been enough to send every doctor in the world to try and figure out what's the connection. Well, the connection is hormones, the connection is inflammation in the body, the connection is a nervous system that's out of control, the connection is emotional dynamics that have you suppress yourself, which has an effect on the immune system. There's all kinds of physiological connections. There's all kinds of evidence for that. But you go to a gynecologist, you say I have endometriosis. Well, let's try a test here. Let me ask you a question. How many of you in the last 5 years have you been to a neurologist, a cardiologist, a dermatologist, a rheumatologist, a respirologist, any kind of an ologist? Just raise your hand, would you? Just raise your hand, okay? All right, good. Now please put your hand down and put your hands up if these people asked you about childhood trauma. Put your hand, one person, you had a very good doctor. Or if they asked you about stress in your life, if they asked you about how your relationship is with your partner, if they asked you about how you feel about your work, how much meaning there is in your life, how you feel about yourself as a human being. You see? And yet those questions and the answers to those questions has everything to do while you were there in the doctor's office. Most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. So that's the problem. I'm so very glad that you found this out for yourself, and now you're supporting other women, because you're going to save a lot of people from surgery and a lifelong suffering that they don't need to have.
Tak já předpokládám, že akce Míček už je zrušena a že už si to řídíte sami, takže není zrušena. A je reálné, že by došlo ke kontaktu Míček i mikrofon?
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for coming. I'm Peter and I'm from Slovakia. I'm a musician and music therapist. And also thank you very much for your yesterday's workshop. It was really interesting for me. And I have a question about music and what do you feel about music and its potential in healing the trauma and in opening the window inside the human being?
Yeah.
And maybe another question, what about you and music?
Okay, well, let me answer the one about music first, okay? Is that okay?
Yeah, okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you.
How many of you have listened to a piece of music and you felt some very strong emotions? Everybody, right? So music is in our bodies and it's in our souls. So where we evolved in nature, there was music. There was the music of the birds, of the wind in the trees, of the grass rustling, of the rushing of the water over the rocks and the rivers and the streams. And virtually every Aboriginal culture has a very strong relationship to music and to rhythm. The first thing we hear when we're in the womb is the beat of our mother's heart. And so music of all kinds speaks to the human soul, and it touches our deepest emotions. So sometimes, literally, when I listen to music, I'm able to feel emotions that otherwise are difficult for me to feel, especially in the past. So when music then is employed in a therapeutic context, of course it's very powerful. Of course it is. So that's my answer. It's therapeutic even when you don't have a therapist, but especially when you do, to help you understand and deeply experience what's going on. So yes. Now you had another question?
My another question was about your personal experience with music therapy maybe your cooperation with some music therapists, if you have some personal experiences with this kind of therapy.
I've been to some sessions with sound therapy and music therapy, just a few. I don't have a lot of experience personally. I do have a lot of experience listening to music. But I don't have a lot of experience going for music therapy personally. But the few sessions that I've had, I certainly see the potential. So that's what I can tell you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Já tady dám poslední dotaz, ne poslední dotaz definitivně, jo, protože nám ještě zbývá 15 minut, ale poslední dotaz tady z jeviště, aby už všechny ostatní byly vaše.
Hi, Gabor. It's an honor to talk to you. And I don't know what kind of therapy do you use personally in your practice?
For myself or for others?
For others. And my question is, if you think that therapy that works with a conscious mind can have the same success as therapy that works with the subconscious mind. What I mean is people going for months and years for CBT, for example, and they trying to heal something what they think is the problem, but the trauma lies underneath. Yeah. And when you use, I don't know, like, for example, hypnotherapy and you find the root cause, yeah. For me personally, I don't think I would be able to heal if I would healing just the feeling and the emotion. I needed to find the root cause to, like, find the excuse for myself. Why did I feel this? So. Yeah.
First of all, the kind of therapy that I do is called compassionate inquiry, and I mentioned it before. And it's studied right now it's been studied by 2,500 people over 80 countries, and every year, 3 times a year, there's about 300, 400 people that sign up for it. And so if any of you are interested, you can check that out, Compassionate Inquiry. It's not easy to do or to study because it's very emotionally demanding, it's just challenging, and mostly because it requires that the therapist first look deeply in themselves, including all their unconscious stuff. So that's the method that I've helped to develop, and it's available both in a professional form and also in a form for people who are not therapists. It's a shorter version, much less expensive, not interactive, but it's available online. That's what I've developed. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other therapies. I don't think I have all the answers. I don't think anybody's got all the answers. So I think there are other wonderful therapies out there. I know that Ivana here has developed biosynthesis. From what it sounds like, it's very similar, at least in principle, to what I do, and it goes underneath the conscious mind. I quite agree with you that just dealing with people's thoughts and behaviors is completely insufficient. It may be helpful in some specific situations, but it's not all that sufficient for healing. And let me tell you a horror story. 4 years ago, I was in Norway speaking at a conference, and I was talking about addictions and trauma. At that conference, there was 2 other speakers, a very famous American psychiatrist, one of the psychiatrists who helped to write the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. So this man helped to write the Diagnostic Manual. The other person was an international, I won't mention names, was an internationally known leader in cognitive behavioral therapy. So the night before the conference, now, naturally, I knew about their work, but they didn't know anything about my work, which is okay. We had dinner. And I asked the psychiatrist, where do you live? And he said, I live in San Diego. I said, oh, you must know Dr. Vincent Felitti. Now, here's the thing. Dr. Vincent Felitti is he's an American physician, and he's the main investigator of what have become known as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, the ACE studies. World famous. They've been published in dozens of medical journals, psychological journals, psychiatric journals. And these Adverse Childhood Experiences studies showed that the more adversity, I should say the more trauma, a child has had, the greater the risk for addiction, the greater the risk for mental health problems, for venereal disease, for criminal behavior, for relationship problems, for physical illness like autoimmune disease. And these studies, as I say, had been published for a couple of decades. So I said to them, you must know Dr. Vincent Felitti, because they live in San Diego. And he said, no, who is he? I said, oh, well, he's the chief investigator of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. This famous American psychiatrist and this famous leader in CBT said, what are those? They never heard of the most famous studies on trauma ever done. And that's the nature of CBT, I think. Now, some practitioners of CBT may be very good therapists, especially if they know how to form a good relationship with their clients. But I'm telling you, as a method, I don't think much about it, because it doesn't go, as you say, to the underlying issues. Now, as to what you said about the unconscious, if you actually look at how the brain develops physiologically, the part of the brain that develops first, this is true both in the evolutionary sense, but also in the individual developmental sense of a human being. The part of the brain that develops first is the emotional brain, not the intellectual brain. Which means, in practical terms, that the right side of the brain, which is the one that's more emotional and more holistic, develops well before the left side of the brain, which is the more intellectual side. Which means that a lot of the experiences that we hold are held in the unconscious part of our brains. So any therapy that ignores that is going to be limited, and any therapy that knows how to work with that is going to be that much more successful. Now, there isn't just one form of therapy. So in my compassionate inquiry, we do get to those unconscious. We have ways of getting to that unconscious material. Biosynthesis does, I'm sure. Neurocognitive therapies get there. Somatic experiencing therapies get there. Hypnosis can get there. Psychedelic work can get there. Certain kind of just working with the body can get there sometimes. But you're quite right. It's essential that we touch and open and help people understand their unconscious lives, not what they consciously think. Because before the baby knows how to think, they feel. And if their feeling lives are balanced, they'll think properly. But you can have people with brilliant minds who are emotionally disconnected, who are unconscious is shut down, and they'll be brilliant idiots because it's not integrated. So yes.
Gábore, já mám jeden osobní dotaz, osobní jakože ode mě, jinak je neosobní. Na základě toho, když jsem viděla ten dokument, kde si teda definujeme, co je příčinou traumatu, že je v podstatě, když to řeknu zjednodušeně, nemocná celá společnost, tak se vás chci zeptat, jestli vy máte nějakou vizi, co s tím?
That's the last chapter of my new book. And,
a já za to jsem placená.
And the answer is, I don't have a very clear vision. And I'm better at diagnosing the problem than giving you a solution. What I can say, some baby steps. So we have to become much more trauma-informed. What if every doctor learned about trauma? That would change the practice of medicine. What if every teacher learned about trauma? That would change the practice of education. What if parents were trained not to get their children to fit into society, but they were trained in understanding their child's needs for healthy development? That would change everything. What if the legal profession virtually every person in jail is a traumatized person. That's why they're there. For example, Czechia has a much more enlightened policy on drugs than, say, Hungary does, but it's still, drug addicts are still persecuted and punished. Why? Because they suffered so much that they escaped into drugs. Now, if you suffer a lot and you escape into alcohol, that's okay. But if you suffered a lot and you escape into opium or heroin, that's against the law. So what are we punishing people for? For having too much pain. So what if the legal profession, the lawyers and the judges, the courts, were trained in trauma? That would change everything. Beyond that, let me tell you a story. The German SS officer who came to Budapest or to Hungary and to Czechoslovakia to deport the Jews to Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek and all these terrible murder factories was Adolf Eichmann. Now, Eichmann was, as you know, captured by the Israelis and brought to trial. And before he was tried, he was examined by several psychiatrists. And they all said he was the most normal person we've ever met. Most normal person. One of them said he's more normal than I am, he said. So we have to rethink our idea of what is normal. We have to rethink our idea of what is normal. And there was a famous American psychologist called Abraham Maslow, M-A-S-L-O-W, who studied what he called self-actualization. People who are truly authentic, who are not afraid to be themselves. And in a very famous paper, he wrote that what was common to these people is that none of them bought into the social values, that they all decided for themselves. They weren't rebels, automatic rebels, and they weren't automatic compliant people. They just had their own sense of what is right and wrong. And they followed that sense. And in a certain way, they had very satisfying lives, but they didn't buy into the social values and the social expectations. So my answer on the individual level is that we all have to seek that authenticity, that connection to our feelings and to our true selves and to our own values, which this society makes it very, very difficult to do that. So to that extent, you have to disconnect from, not to leave society, but not to internalize its values and its expectations, which expect you to suppress yourself. On the social level, let's go back to evolution. How did we evolve? We evolved in connection. So the challenge for the modern age is we can't go back to being hunter-gatherers. That's not the point. And we all know how poorly the experiment with enforcing communality, how poorly that went here, in Russia, in Hungary. So that's not the model either. But there's got to be some way we have to figure out how to honor our need for connection and communality and mutual support with modern life. And that's the challenge. I don't have a formula, but that's the challenge.
Ale vy jste jako mě na tu otázku odpověděl. Ta vize je změna vzdělávání, protože jestliže to získáváme v dětství, tak ta změna by dle mého názoru měla být taky v dětství, v tom, jak ovlivňujeme naše děti, jak je spolu vytváříme. Časově, jinak jsme se naplnili. Chci se vás zeptat, Gábore, jestli to takhle cítíte OK, nebo jestli ještě chcete dát prostor pro nějaký dotaz.
My body in a minute is going to say no, all right? So I'll take one more question, okay? One more.
Takže poslední otázka.
Does this work? Oh, yeah. Great to have the last question. I'm over here.
Hi.
First of all, I'm a bit starstruck because I've been following your work for many, many years, and it's a great honor to finally see you in the flesh.
Thank you.
As one says. Following your work, I also have a particular interest in your take on capitalism.
Capitalism, yeah.
Which you, pretty much in everything I've read from you describe as breeding grounds for trauma.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to reiterate on that a bit, and I'd like to ask a question on specifically something that can work as, I don't know, a way to curb the effects of capitalism. A policy that's called unconditional basic income. There was an experiment in Ontario that you may be familiar with or not. What the policy is essentially is direct cash transfers to all members of a community or citizens of a community without any conditions or any requirements, so as a human right. And the various pilot programs and experiments that have been done show a great potential for mental health, among others, exactly because it gives the people agency. It gives people the power to get to their own self-actualization instead of only punish them retroactively for not fitting the norm. So I don't know how much you've heard of the policy, but I'd really like your take on this super brief introduction.
First of all, I have to confess, I'm very surprised what you said about Ontario, because I'm not aware of any such policy, okay? In fact, Ontario is one of the most right-wing governments in Canada. So if they have such a policy, that's news to me. I'll have to
Just
go.
An experiment that was cut short by the government.
Once I check on my computer, I'll have to see if what you say is accurate. If it is, I'm totally surprised. But even if it's true, it's not enough. Because it's not just about income. Now, by the way, you asked me about capitalism. You mentioned that. I said this yesterday. I don't know if you remember, there was an old joke in Eastern Europe when I was growing up. The question was, what's capitalism? Capitalism is when man exploits man. And what is socialism? In socialism, it's the other way around. And that's how it worked, unfortunately. Even if a society provided guaranteed income to all its citizens, which from my point of view would be a step in the right direction, it still wouldn't meet human needs. Because people don't just have needs for physical sustenance. That's a basic need. And when you think of the absurdity of living in a world where we have all this wealth and 8 people own as much wealth as the bottom 50% of humanity, I mean, it's somebody looking at us from the Mars would think this is insane. So it's not just about income security. It's also about equality of status. That some people are not worth more than other people. It's also about participation in decision making. So it's not that a few people at the top with the most wealth make all the decisions, but that we genuinely have a democracy. Now, democracy means ruled by the people. So even if you had basic income, there'd be a lot of human needs that would not necessarily be met for equality, for justice, for agency, for dignity. So that would be a step in the right direction and would relieve the suffering of certain people. It would not be sufficient to create a really humane society. Okay? All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Děkujeme. Děkujeme Gáborovi. Poprosíme ho ještě, než se všichni rozloučíme, o společné foto účinkujících a asistentů. A než dojde ke shromáždění focení.
Of course, yeah.
Než dojde ke shromáždění focení, tak jsem se s vámi chtěla rozloučit, ale nevím, jestli se tady něco neděje. Ještě na předání květin, poděkování, prosba o společnou fotku.
Last night I was at the, what was the hall where the music was last night?
We've been in the Rodolfinum.
We were at the Rodolfinum, where there was a young Czech conductor making his debut, and it was a beautiful concert. They played Debussy, and they played Mozart, they played Janacek, and they played Ligeti, and at the end of the performance, he got his flowers. So I feel like I've just made my debut performance, so thank you.
Vy jste náš Janáček.
Thank you.